Hello and welcome to Whoever You Thought You Were, You're a Jew, the TV show that teaches the ignored truths of history. We also teach this concept over here, and we try to get away from this one, the golden calf. Today's show is called Race, and I can't think of a subject where the expression the ignored truths of history is more apt than this one. When we talk about race, we're talking about that group of people that white people sometimes call niggers. I wonder how many of you actually know what that word means. You will by the end of this show. Now, if I were to tell you that blacks once had a great culture which exceeded the culture of whites, you'd probably find that pretty incredible. But we're talking about the ignored truths of history. Those of you who've been watching this show may perhaps recall that several weeks ago we talked about the fact that most of the Jews alive in the world today may actually be descendants of Russian converts. Now, Jews like to consider themselves to be descendants of Israel. So the fact that Russia was once a Jewish nation for 500 years, in fact, and that most Jews who are alive today may be more closely descended from Attila the Hun than from King Solomon, these are facts which are just glaring facts, and it's incredible that such things could be ignored. And the question of how such things could be ignored has an answer, and the answer is collusion. All the parties involved have silently agreed, even perhaps without ever talking to each other, they've silently agreed to just not discuss this subject. In the case of the Russian Khazar Jews, it's embarrassing and frightening to Jews to consider the possibility that they may actually be descendants of converts and may have very little Israeli blood in them. In the case of the Russians, it's a horrendous embarrassment to them to admit that for 500 years in the Middle Ages, Russia was a Jewish nation.
So as a Gentile, I'm here to profess, black people, you are Israelites, you are the chosen ones, you are a prestigious people. Your history is in the Bible. In order to better understand why you are Israelites, I'm going to bring forward two witnesses from Deuteronomy 28. And if you're not familiar with it, Deuteronomy 28 outlines the curses of the Israelites for not hearkening unto the voice of the Lord. Now I'll bring forth my first witness from Deuteronomy 28 and 15. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. So because you didn't keep your end of the covenant, follow the law, statutes, and commandments, you've been cursed. Let's take a look at one of those curses and see if it applies. Deuteronomy 28:66 reads, And thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shall have no assurance of thy life. Now, I don't know about you, I live in America. Black people have no assurance of their life, and it's because you're Israelite.
A very beautiful morning and evening to all of you who are watching this video. Welcome back to my YouTube commentary. I'll say this. I want to step into a subject that shakes the foundation of religion. A subject that shakes the foundation of history and identity. So I want us, all of us, to strap our belts because we are going to talk about who are the real Jews of the Bible. We are going to pass by history. We are going to talk about religion. So I hope you'll be okay with that. I know we have done this before about the real Jews, but there's a video of a white Ashkenazi I just come through it online. So I said, let us talk about this again because we need to talk about this. We need to have this discussion. Our youths need to hear about this today, tomorrow, the other day. We will still do this. I'll still do this. Whenever I get another material to share with you, I'll still do that. Okay? So I'll say this. For centuries, the world has been taught to see Jewishness through a European perspectives or a European lens. Synagogues in Europe, the Ashkenazi culture, dominance, and Hollywood portrays that. And it has cemented something, an image of a pale-skinned Jews as the default. But what if I told you today this image is incomplete? What if I told you today that the Bible itself points in another direction, okay? And that scholars, genetics, and even voices within the Ashkenazi world have admitted times that the true story runs deeper, darker, and undeniably African. This is not just a commentary of hate or of division. No, no, no. This is about restoring balance. It's about reclaiming erased voices and showing that Africa's story is central, not just on the edge, okay? And we are going to pass through biblical truth. And before we go down, I want you to watch this clip from this white professor, and then I'll come back with my history lines.
Now, if I were to tell you that blacks, for as many centuries as whites have been superior, if you want, in the Western world, that for just as many centuries blacks were superior, you'd probably find that hard to believe. And you'd wonder how such a fact could be hidden. And the answer is, again, collusion. The whites wouldn't want to admit such a thing, because whites like to feel superior and like to think that their superiority is somehow permanent, decreed by God. As for blacks, if you look into the black civilizations that we're going to take a look at momentarily, you find something pretty interesting. You find that those civilizations actually arose as Jewish civilizations, later to become Islamic civilizations. Now, we live in a nation where blacks are taught that whitey got ahead by being a liar and a thief. So today's so-called black leaders get on the air and proclaim that the way to get ahead in America is for the black man to be a better liar and thief than whitey. I don't know about you, but I've thought about this matter, and there's no question in my mind as to where these so-called black leaders come from. They were put up there by whitey. Now, I'm not going to name any names. But the truth of the matter is that the roots of black greatness historically lay in Judaism and Islam. So the blacks who are teaching today that the answer to the question, how do you get ahead, is get the money, dollar bill, y'all. You folks know who I'm talking about, and that's what they teach. They don't want to hear any talk about God. For these people, the dollar bill, y'all crowd, the realization that black greatness in the past lay in roots which go into Judaism and Islam is not really what they want to hear. So they just ignore it. As for the blacks in this country who are not dollar bill, y'all people, we find that most of them are members of Christian churches, which is a good thing, except for the fact that they've been taught since childhood that Judaism and Islam are the enemy. And they've been taught that lesson so well that when they start to hear that the roots of black greatness historically lay in Islam, that's as far as they're going to go with that. They'll take slavery, thank you. So there you have it, collusion. For whitey, it's great to keep black down. And for the blacks, it's great to not admit that in the past you were a Jew and later a Muslim. Now we're going to talk about the truths of history, the ignored truths. These truths are known to you if you're a black Muslim in America. You already know this if you're a black Muslim. But if you're a black treated in those whorehouses and condom vending machine buildings that we call public schools, then you probably don't know this. And if you're a white, you almost certainly don't know this. Let's talk a little bit about black history, and let's start with a map. This is a map of the area around the Mediterranean Sea. Up here we have Europe. Here's Africa. I think you can see on your screens that in this area of Africa that I'm pointing to is a desert. This, of course, is the Sahara Desert. The territory to the north is fertile, and the territory to the south is fertile. In fact, it's very fertile. Now let's talk about empires. The first great empire in Western civilization was probably Egypt, over here. Not much is known about the early Egyptian empire. There's lots of speculation. But in the process of time, the empire passed. Israel was great for a short time, but that didn't last either. Now, I don't have to tell you that a great empire arose in Greece. Most historians of intellectual Western history trace the history of Western intellectualism to Greece. Now, the Greek Empire didn't last too long, a number of centuries. One could reasonably ask why Greece became so great and why it was unable to hold on to its greatness. One could write whole books on that subject, and I'm sure that lots of such books have been written. But the fact of the matter is that for whatever reason, the Greek Empire rose, the Greek Empire fell. Subsequently, Western civilization moved over here to Italy. That's, of course, what we now call the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire at its peak stretched from Spain all the way around the Mediterranean, encompassing Arabia and parts of northern Africa. The Roman Empire lasted longer than just about any other, better part of 1,000 years, but in the process of time, Rome passed as well. There was a Persian Empire, which had its roots over here in Persia, actually over here, Iran. The Persian Empire at its peak stretched from Egypt, encompassing most of the Middle East, just about up to Greece. And the Persian Empire passed as well. The end of the Persian Empire came, I guess around the year 640 or so, when the armies of Muhammad began to conquer the Middle East, a process which was completed with lightning rapidity. So the next great empire was the Empire of Islam, an empire which, in many respects, has not ended to this day. It arose in Saudi Arabia, immediately conquered the entire Middle East, conquered Persia. The Persian Empire was Zoroastrian in religion. They got rid of that, replaced it with Islam. They tried desperately to get into Europe at this end and failed, but what they did do was they came across North Africa, and North Africa fell to the Muslims. It fell quickly, so that by the year 710, they were over here at the Straits of Gibraltar. That was only, about 60 years after the death of Muhammad. It took them only 60 years to conquer the entire Middle East and get over to this point right here. This puts us at the year 710 AD. Now in the year 710 AD, a fellow by this name, let's get him to stand up a little better, Tariq ibn Ziyad, means Tariq the son of Ziyad. Tariq was, I believe, a Moroccan. This is Morocco over here. In other words, he was a Moor, a man from Morocco. This whole North African empire, Islamic empire, came to be called the Moors, or in Shakespeare, the Blackamoors. Sounds like we had some black people there, huh? Tariq took the armies of Islam across the Straits of Gibraltar and landed on the Rock in the year 710 AD. You'll never guess what he did next. He burned the boats. He'd made up his mind that if his armies of Islam could not conquer Spain, they weren't going home. So he burned the damn boats, and that left them facing one way, which was straight forward. And in the year 710, they swept across the Iberian Peninsula, and they took the land that we now call Spain for Islam. For just about 800 years, until precisely the year 1492, the year Columbus sailed for America. For almost 800 years, Spain was a Muslim country. The army stopped at the Pyrenees Mountains because they couldn't beat the French. In honor of his conquest, they called what is now called the Rock of Gibraltar Jabal al-Tariq, which means the Mountain of Tariq. And the British, in their inimitable way, turned Jabal al-Tariq into Gibraltar. We now had an African Muslim empire which stretched from the Pyrenees Mountains, encompassing all of Spain, Morocco, and the whole north coast of Africa right up to Egypt, and the area south into the Sahara Desert as far as any man cared to stake a claim. This northern African empire, which was eventually headquartered in Spain, went under three names, and here they are. All the same empire, really, but three different names. From 710, the year that the Muslims moved into Spain, up until about the time of the Crusades, this was called the Umayyad Empire. And it wasn't just North Africa, because at that time, up until the Crusades, Islam had a world government. It was one empire, ruled from Damascus, and it was called the Umayyad Empire. But around the time of the Crusades, the Umayyad Empire fell apart into smaller empires. And the empire encompassing Spain and North Africa at that point was called the Almoravid Empire, later the Almohad Empire. These names, Almoravid and Almohad, come from names of tribes, but it was all basically the same region. This area, from Spain, North Africa, all the way to Egypt and well into the Sahara Desert, an area just about the size of Western Europe. Now, around the time of the Crusades, Islam made its way across the Sahara Desert into this fertile sub-Saharan region, and a second Islamic empire arose down here. This empire also went under different names, and here are the names. Originally it was called Ghana, but not the Ghana of today. A huge mass of land, which we're going to show you again in a minute. Later it came to be called the Kingdom of Mali. And finally, at around the time of Columbus, it was called the Kingdom of Songhai, Songhai being the name of an African tribe which conquered the territory. 3 different names, but all really the same kingdom. A kingdom comprising the area from Senegal over here, all the way across the fertile sub-Saharan region to Chad, and well into the Sahara Desert. Again, an area almost the size of Western Europe. Now, I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but I'm pointing now to a river. This river flows from the mountains coming originally from Senegal, first east and then south. It's called the Niger River. And along the shores of the Niger River arose a civilization which eventually became the center of civilization in the Western world. Its headquarters was here. This is a city called Timbuktu. To those of you who are not familiar with this history, it might sound a little like a joke. Timbuktu. Timbuktu, at the time that Columbus sailed for America, was the center of Western civilization. Right here in the heart of Africa, on the shores of the Niger River. In other words, this was a city of niggers, some people would like to call them. But they outdid Whitey. Europe at this time was a mess. There was no real civilization to speak of. The Renaissance was just starting at the time that Timbuktu, down in the heart of so-called darkest Africa, was the center of world civilization. Sounds impossible, doesn't it? Not only is it possible, it was true. And if you don't believe it, look it up in any encyclopedia. It's just another one of those ignored facts of history. And again, as I said at the outset of this program, the reason that the historians are able to get away with this is collusion. All the parties involved would just as soon not think about it. Now, before proceeding, I want to show you a few books. This book is called From Babylon to Timbuktu, written by Rudolph Windsor. I've spoken to Rudolph Windsor a few times. He's a great writer, and he takes the history of the sub-Saharan black empires as well as the northern Saharan black empires and makes them very readable. All the information in this book can be verified in any encyclopedia, but it's more interesting to read it here. Because Mr. Windsor is a sponsor of this show, we're going to be giving the address of his publishing company at the end. You can also obtain this book in many black bookstores or street stalls which cater to black books, although you won't necessarily be able to find this in Barnes & Noble. Great book. Here's another book which is a big source of information for me. It's called World's Great Men of Color. And this is a book you shouldn't have too much trouble finding in a library or elsewhere. It was written by J.A. Rogers, one of the great black writers of the early 20th century. Finally, here's a book that I'd love to be able to talk about, but I doubt there'll be time. It's called The Sign and the Seal by Graham Hancock. It was a bestseller for its genre not too long ago. It tells the story of the Ark of the Covenant. And if you're like me, by the time you finish this book, you're going to believe, as the author believes, that the Ark of the Covenant is in Ethiopia, where it's been for thousands of years. That is, God, if Mr. Hancock is correct, gave the Ark of the Covenant to niggers. Think about that. Of course, a lot of people don't believe that. I'm not 100% sure it's true myself, but I'm about 90% convinced. In any event, I don't think we're going to have time to talk about the Ark today. Let's talk about Spain during the Middle Ages. I want to read something to you. I want to read you a little passage about Moorish Spain as Europe's cultural center. Although the white Christians of Spain deeply desired, during this entire period, to expel the blackamoors from their country, it is nevertheless an undisputed historical fact that medieval Spain was the cultural, educational, and scientific center of Europe. The Moorish kings lived in castles of highly polished marble, with elaborately carved walls and beautiful mosaic floors, while European kings lived in cold, damp castles of unfinished stone, crude by comparison. The streets of Spain's capital city, Cordova, were well paved and completely illuminated by public lights, at a time when the streets of London were dark and covered with mud. The Moors possessed all the knowledge of ancient Greece, which was lost to Europe until the Renaissance. They made important contributions to philosophy, medicine, mathematics, chemistry, astronomy, and botany. Doesn't sound like such a dark age after all, does it? There were academies for the rich, free schools for the poor, and libraries containing books from all over the world. The Jews of medieval Spain got along famously with the Muslims, and for them the sojourn in that nation is remembered as being the second most glorious period in their history, exceeded only by the glory of the reigns of David and Solomon in ancient Israel. Medieval Spain was the time and place of Maimonides and many of the other great Old Testament scholars, whose works constitute the foundations of modern Jewish thought. Throughout the Middle Ages, the white Christians of Spain endeavored to thrust out the Moors. It took them until 1492 to do that. When Isabella and Ferdinand finally defeated the last Moorish king in Granada, in the same year that they financed Columbus's trip to America, they immediately expelled all Jews who refused to accept Christianity. This is not at all surprising. Since the Jews had actively supported the Moorish conquests, the Christians were not about to take any chances on losing what had taken them 800 years to regain. The day the last Moors and Jews were expelled from Spain was counted as a great day in Spanish history. But was it? It's true that Spain, largely through the strength of its navy, had achieved the status of a world power. But in less than a century, the Spanish Armada was defeated by England, and the nation went into a great decline. Now we're going to ask a very important question. During the Middle Ages, were Spain's Muslim rulers really black? It's almost inevitable that white people who have never been taught black history will ask this question. Were they really black? After all, Moors are kind of Arabic. They're not really Negro, are they? And the answer to the question is that there was more than one race involved. Again, as I told you before, in the beginning there was the Umayyad dynasty, and they were mainly Arabic, although there were some blacks there. But by about the time of the Crusades, the Umayyad dynasty became soft and complacent, and the forces of Christianity were rising up in Spain and threatening to overthrow Islam. A second dynasty of kings arose called the Almoravids. They came out of Senegal, which is right in the middle of Africa. That's about as black as you can get. They conquered Spain, and they were the rulers from then until the end. Centuries. There's no question that Spain was ruled by blacks, at least during the latter part of the Middle Ages. The third dynasty, the Almohads, was also a mixed dynasty. The greatest of the Almohad kings was a fellow who they called Al-Mansur, which means the Invincible. His actual name was Yaqub ibn Yusuf, which means Jacob, son of Joseph, almost like a Jewish name. Al-Mansur arose at a time when the Christian forces were really rearing up and threatening to expel Islam. The Christians put together a huge army of 300,000 men at a place called Alarcos. Al-Mansur called together all the forces of Islam from all across North Africa, all the way to Egypt, and put together an army which beat the Christians at Al-Alarcos in one of the greatest battles in history. Now, Al-Mansur was the son of a man who was described as being of mixed race, but his mother was a full-blooded Negro slave from Senegal or Timbuktu. That makes Al-Mansur at least 75% Negro. And that's about as colored as any black man walking the streets of America today. So the answer to the question is yes, Spain was ruled by blacks during the period when it was indisputably the cultural, scientific, and educational center of Europe, believe it or not. Now, the slightly out of focus map on the left-hand side of your screen shows the approximate boundaries of the medieval Great Black Sub-Saharan Kingdom, known variously as Ghana and then Mali and later Songhai, all the same kingdom, a rather large kingdom. The yellow color shows the modern nation of Mali, which is of course much smaller. And right in the midst of it is a large black arrow showing the location of Timbuktu, the greatest city of that nation. I'd like to read you something about Timbuktu. This kingdom was originally called the Kingdom of Ghana. From about 300 AD up to the time of the Crusades, Ghana was a Jewish nation. This has been documented by the writings of one Eldad the Danite, whose works constitute the main historical source of information for this time or place. So this was a Jewish kingdom. Did you know that there were Jewish kingdoms in Africa? After North Africa was converted to Islam, an immensely lucrative trade developed between Ghana and the Islamic states to the north. In other words, the empire that was centered in Spain, which we talked about. At first, the Ghanans traded gold, then iron, which was used to make weapons. Eventually, they traded grain, which proved to be the most lucrative of all. Shortly after the year 1000 AD, the kings of Ghana converted to Islam. Subsequently, the city of Timbuktu became the center of trade for the entire world, not just Africa. At that time in history, movement of goods across Europe from land was out of the question, because Europe was a collection of warring barbarian states. So all goods from the east, and that means all goods period, because there weren't nothing being made in the west at that time, all goods from the east were brought to Egypt, where they were loaded onto caravans. The caravan routes all converged at Timbuktu, which, by the 15th century, had become one of the wealthiest cities in the world. From Timbuktu, the goods were transported 1,000 miles to the Atlantic coast, from where they were loaded onto ships bound for Europe. In the 14th century, the University of Sankore was founded at Timbuktu, and this city began to become one of the world's leading centers of academic learning. Ghana, which by then was known as Songhai, came to be known as the Mecca of the Sudan. By the year 1500, this empire in the heart of so-called darkest Africa had become the center of the Islamic world, at a time when the Renaissance in Europe had barely begun. The students of Timbuktu were sent out to the great Muslim universities of Spain, North Africa, and Asia, and the learned men of all races and nationalities were paid handsomely to come into Timbuktu to teach. The commodity which came to be the most profitable object of trade in Timbuktu was not gold or silver or grain, but books. It has been written that there were more books in the library of the University of Sankore than in all the libraries of Europe combined. It is also said that the entire body of male free citizens was literate. Leadership and authority were in hands of the learned scholars of the city. There was a legendary 14th century Muslim traveler named Ibn Battuta. He's kind of like the Marco Polo of the Arab world. And this is what Ibn Battuta had to say about Timbuktu, and I quote, "The inhabitants had a greater abhorrence of injustice than any other people. Neither the man who travels nor he who stays at home has anything to fear from robbers or men of violence." The driving force behind these developments was God and nothing else. Timbuktu arose as a Jewish empire and blossomed under the banners of Islam. There's no question about what the source of greatness was, not black skin color, but God. So maybe you're starting to understand what I mean when I say, whoever you thought you were, you're a Jew. We're out of time now. Please tune in next week when we're going to talk about the relationship between God and enlightenment. Are there two different ultimate realities, or are these two the same? Or maybe they're both wrong. If you want to know the answer to the question, tune in next week and find out. Thank you, and goodbye.
Whenever people say that black people are the real Jews of the Bible, it rattles so global order, And the reason is because the image of God's chosen people has been whitened, has been whitewashed, okay? If the Asians Israelites were black, if they looked more like Africans than Israelites or than Europeans, okay, then centuries of white supremacy, colonial missionary work, and Eurocentric theology crumbles overnight. Think about this. Colonialism used religion to do their work, okay? Or colonialism used religion as a weapon. The slave trade justified itself by calling Africans cursed, by pointing to the so-called curse of Ham, okay? Yet, if the very people they enslaved are the children of Israel, the chosen of God, then the entire theological falls apart. And that's why this conversation is more than identity, it's more than politics. It is revolutionary, and it threatens to undo centuries of manipulations. And that's why we are not taught so much about this. That's why we don't come across this mostly in schools and everywhere. Okay? Now, I'll say this. To understand this controversy narrative, we must first understand that what is or who are the Ashkenazi Jews, because they are part or they are the largest Jewish group in the world today. Okay? Now, their history includes persecution, history includes ghettos, history includes pogroms, and of course, the Holocaust. So, they have suffered and preserved, or they have suffered and persevered, but their identity is not the whole of Jewishness. Genetic studies show that Ashkenazi Jews carry a mix of Middle Eastern ancestry and European ancestry. So their paternal lines lean more towards the Middle East, but their maternal lines often trace back to European women who converted centuries ago. This means that while their identity as Jews is historically valid, their appearance, pale skin, light eyes, European features is the result of admixture, not a picture of ancient Israelites. Some Ashkenazi scholars even acknowledge this. Not even some, even the video we have watched acknowledge this. They say, yes, our ancestors mixed in Europe and we are part of the Jewish story, but not identical to the original Hebrews. Okay? Now, that admission is a key because it opens the door for us to ask questions, if not them. And who are the real Hebrews? Who are the real biblical Israelites? We are going to answer those questions here, and the professor have answered that question. I'm just now bringing it on the table. Okay, now let's continue. As Africa has always been part of biblical story. Okay, from the marriage of Moses to an Ethiopian woman to the Queen of Sheba's journey to King Solomon, Africa is not a side character. Africa, it is central. The Nile River flows through Israelite history. Egypt, Cush, and Ethiopia are mentioned dozens of times in scripture. Now, the Beta Israelites of Ethiopia, for example, kept Jewish traditions for centuries, okay, isolated from Europe. Their story is powerful. They believed themselves to be descendants of Solomon and Sheba, or Israelites of who migrated south long before the rise of the rise of Ashkenazi. Okay, so they practiced curriculums or like circumcision. They practice it's called what, kosher dietary rules, something like that, you know. And even they practiced a Sabbath of observance. Okay, they did that, and they did that without any contact with the European Jews. So when they were finally rediscovered in the modern era, Israel itself acknowledged their authenticity or their authenticity. Okay, they are lifting tens of thousands of Jerusalem or tens of thousands to Jerusalem in the year 1980s and 1990s, if I'm not wrong. Okay. When you go to the Lemba of South Africa, they tell the similar stories. They say their ancestor came from the north, bringing with them Jewish tradition, and genetic studies shocked the world too, because many Lemba men carry Y chromosomes with the Cohen marker, the same marker found in Jews' priestly lineage. This means their oral history was not a myth, it was memory preserved. We're getting there, okay? Now, that is history. Let me go to the Bible, okay? The scripture itself. The Israelites spent centuries in Egypt. They were often mistaken for Egyptians who were clearly black people. And Joseph's brothers didn't recognize him because he looked like the Egyptians. Hello? Hello.
Niko nataka tu.
Hebu niambie ni kitu kubwa.
Hakuna kitu.
Niambie.
Si uko nataka tu tuongee.
Sawa, acha nimalize kwanza.
Tutaongea baadaye.
Sawa. Bye.
Take care.
Take care.
I love you.
Love you too. Joseph's brother didn't even recognize him because he looked like Egyptians. Okay? Moses too was mistaken for an Egyptian. Paul was called an Egyptian. What does this tell you? If Israelites were regularly confused with Africans, then they couldn't have been Europeans. They had to resemble the people of the region. Dark-skinned, woolly hair, rooted in African appearance, okay? And the prophets describe Israelites as having hair like wool, skin like bronze. And these descriptions are not for European. These are African features. So this matters. It matters because when we put scriptures next to history, it paints a clear picture. The ancient Hebrews were people of color, closer to Africans and closer than to modern Europeans. Now, we have gone through history a little bit and we have gone through the biblical story. Now, why the lie? Why the lie? Because they know the truth. And this truth has been hidden because colonialism needed to separate Africans from divine identity. So, if enslaved Africans believed that they were the children of Israelites, they were chosen by God, they will never accept chains. So, Europeans gave them a white Jesus and a white Moses and a white David and a white Mary. They rewrote holy identity to match their own reflection so that they can be believed that we are representative of God. So on what we tell you, it stands. So the rewriting justified oppression. African became heathens considers to the biblical story. The very songs sung by enslaved Africans, "Go down Moses, let my people go," reveal that deep insight that they always knew the truth, So the spirituals were not random. They were coded memory and a connection to Israelites' heritage buried under centuries of chains. Now, when you put history and prophecy together, the Bible says that the children of Israel will be scattered to the four corners of the world. Okay? And that scattering or diaspora did not look like a peaceful vacation. It looked like captivity, exile, and chains. So after the fall of Jerusalem in the 70s, Israelites were dispersed across Africa, across Arabia and beyond. And many fell south in the Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, and West Africa. So from there, generations passed and these Israelites blended into local population, keeping fragments of their culture, okay? Like circumcision, dietary laws, and the traditions. Okay, even as outside powers tried to erase them, but it just remained intact because they were practicing it. So when we look at the transatlantic slave trade, the pattern becomes even clear because millions of Africans were stolen from West Africa. Many of those regions like Igbo in the Nigeria, Ashanti in Ghana, the tribes in Senegal and Gambia carried traditionals that echoed ancient Israel. Okay, like names, customs, rhythms of worship, and even European slave traders themselves sometimes recorded in their diaries that these people believe they are Israelites. This is not coincidence. Okay? This is not coincidence. This is prophecy fulfilled. A people stripped of land, language, and freedom, yet still carrying the divine spark of identity wherever they went. So, reality shows that all the picture, all the narrative, all the story shows that the Jews of the Bible or the true Hebrews were black people. So, a lot of time you come across that black Americans are the real Israelites. Black Americans are true, just the black Americans and the Israelites connection. And here is where the fire burns to the hottest. Why? Because black Americans, descendants of enslaved Africans, carry the unshakable connection to the story of Israel's. Okay? For example, Egyptian bondage is equals to American slavery. When you talk about Pharaoh's whip, that's a plantation master slash. When you talk about the Moses saying, "Let my people go," That is like, for example, Harriet Tubman leading them through the Underground Railroad. When we say about Babylonian captivity, that's like Jim Crow segregation. So this is why African American spiritual sound like echoes of Exodus. Okay, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Wade in the Water, Go Down Moses. So these were not random hymns. These were coded Israelite memory, survival songs connecting a suffering people back to the biblical narrative. Okay, and Black Americans have always felt that, yes, we are the people of that book. No amount of whitewashing could erase that. Even now, movement across the diaspora are reclaiming Israelites' identity, saying boldly that we are not slaves, we are chosen people who lost our name but not our soul. Okay? So it shows, because through the suffering of Black Americans, from captivity, from the ships across the ocean to the plantations, the story of Black Americans is exactly the story of Israelites. That's why I always say, the one who wrote the Bible, the one who wrote the story of the Israelites, he was writing the story of the Black people being in slavery. It has taken a number of years for Black Americans to start coming to Africa, but now they are coming. That's just like Canaan. This is Canaan. Now, we must be careful, or we must treat careful but honestly, because when I go back to history, in the 20th century, we are in 21st, we have something we call political Zionism, the movement that built the modern state of Israel. Okay, it was largely led by European Jews, mostly Ashkenazi group, and their suffering in Europe was real, especially the Holocaust. It gave agency to finding a homeland, but here is the tension. While building their state, they centered their own European identity as the face of Jewishness and sidelined non-European Jews, okay, including African Jews. Look at how better Israelites were treated when they arrived in Israel. They were doubled, they were tested, sometimes even rejected, okay? And this is because their blackness did not fit the European imagination of what Jews look like. So many Ethiopian Jews had to fight just to be recognized, even after centuries of practicing Israel's faith. And this shows us something painful but important. Identity can be weaponized, okay? When political power enters the room, those who control the narrative decides who counts and who doesn't. And that's why we hear Ashkenazi admits that Black people are the real Jews, because when the evidence is undeniable, even those holding power must confess fragments of truth. And that's why I played this video of a white professor, of a white Ashkenazi professor. He is telling us openly about this, okay? And we have examples like oral tradition and memory tested, something like that, because and science, okay? Because genetic is so much powerful. So when you talk about science, studies show that shared ancestry among Jews across the world. But the truth is, DNA cannot measure covenant. DNA cannot measure memory. DNA cannot measure the songs passed from grandmothers to grandchild, the stories whispered in the late night, the rituals kept alive under the threat of death. So oral traditional is history written in the soul, okay? For the Lemba to say that for centuries we are children of Israelites, and the modern science to then confirm pieces of the claim, this shows that silence of memory or resilience of memory for the better Israelites to practice Jewish law in Ethiopia without contact with Europe. That proves that identity can survive in hidden corners. So while scientists debate percentage of ancestry, let us remember, covenant is not about percentage. It's about calling. And calling cannot be erased by colonial lies nor whitewashing of scripture. Okay? Kings and queens, I want you to ask yourself, why does this conversation of Jews mostly cause so much fear? Why do governments, religious institutions, and media scramble whenever someone says Black people are the real Jews? This is because if the descendants of slavery rise and declare themselves as Israel, the system trembles. Because suddenly the poorest and most oppressed people on earth stand up and say that we are God covenant people. We are not victims, we are heirs. Colonialism survives by telling you that you are nothing. You have no history. It tells you that you are nothing. You have no history. You have no destiny, no covenant, But when you realize that the Bible is not about white faces, in robes, but about your ancestors, then you see chains breaking. And that is dangerous to every empire built on lies. You know, when we balance the scales while affirming African and black identity in the Israel story, we must not erase others. Jews' identity is layered, okay? It is a religion, it is ancestry, it is culture, it is law. Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardi Jews, Mizrahi Jews, they all are part of Jews' story, but they are not the whole story. The danger is when one group tries to monopolize the title Israel Jews or real Jew, okay? And that leads to exclusion, racism, and even violence. Because what we must do, instead of the reclaim that erased Africa voices without erasing others, to say the Israelites were a black and brown people, diaspora spread them everywhere, and no one group could or can erase another's truth. This is not about hate. It's about just a wholeness, you know. Now, when you look around, the awakening is happening. Across America, across Africa, the Caribbean, in Europe, black people are reclaiming the lost history. They are reading the Bible with new eyes. They are seeing themselves not as cast, but as chosen. They are standing up and saying that we are not slaves, we are Israelites. We are covenant people rising. And prophecy said it would be this way, okay? That in the last days, the dry bones will rise. The scattered will remember their names. And the oppressed will rediscover their inheritances. And that day is no other day. It is now. And that's why you are hearing this commentary today, because the spirit of truth is moving. Okay? Grand Rising family, this truth is heavy, I know, but it's liberating. It's very true that the Ashkenazi Jews dominate the global image of Jewishness. Genetic too confirms that their connection, but also they are mixing in Europe. But the story does not end there. Africa is the center of the Bible. The Beta Israels, the Lemba, the African diaspora, all hold the keys to the Israel story. So, what we should do is that we must study, we must reclaim, and we must teach our children that their story did not begin with chains on slave ships, but with covenant at Sinai. So we demand that history books to tell the whole truth, and most of all, we live as chosen with dignity, unity, and power. Because the real Jews of the Bible are not a mystery hidden in Europe. Okay? They are the oppressed, the scattered, and the ones who kept singing freedom songs in the night. And they are here, and they are us. Until next episode, peace out.